The more self-explanatory a concept is, the harder it often is to program, and movement is easily the best example of that principle. It's easy to tell what feels good and bad, but what are the mechanics behind the magic? How do you refine them, improve them, and most importantly, how do you fit them to your game's perfect pace? In this first installment of the frebbloog, we'll be discussing what I learned over my 3-year journey to figure that out, so that your journey can hopefully be a bit shorter. Before you can keep the pace, you need to find it, and that's where demos come in. Demo early, demo frequently, demo publicly, and most importantly, demo to an audience that understands the type of game you're making. If it's similar to a popular series, track down fandom and fangame websites that accept indie projects. Some of the critique you get will be directly helpful, but many people will also be playing the game wrong. Take special note of these players. Their mistakes indicate not only how people would rather be playing your game, but also how they think it's telling them to play. Once you identify the most common mistakes, you have 2 options: improve your conveyance or adjust your mechanics to not punish them. In early builds of frebbventure, many players use the run button very sparingly. The issues they caused were easily avoidable, and the complaints they made felt unfair, but in a way they had the right idea. A run button is a needless extra step that most modern platformers simply cut. Inspired by many of those same players only using it to avoid boss attacks, I rebound the newly freed key to a simple quick dodge. The foundation of any platformer movement system is good ground handling. Going from a standstill to a run and back needs to feel both instantaneous and smooth. Sound impossible? It's not easy. Finding a good balanced acceleration rate only gets harder the faster your character is, but therein lies the trick. You don't need to find just one. Frebb, for his part, has very high raw acceleration but 2 separate speed caps. An initial soft cap of 3 keeps his swift takeoff under control, but gradually pushes up to the hard cap of 5.2 as he continues running. After around a half second of not moving, his soft cap resets to the initial value of 3. In order to keep the pace while changing directions, turning while sprinting initiates a skid. At the beginning of the animation, the player's horizontal speed is stored in a temporary variable. After the animation completes, the stored value is reapplied to his horizontal speed and multiplied by -1, resulting in a snappy and impactful rebound. Though not a mechanic, animation also plays a big role in how good your run feels. Running animation speed should always scale multiplicatively with your absolute horizontal speed, and care should be taken to make sure your character's feet aren't moving too much faster or slower than your x-coordinate. A weighty, bouncy animation will also make your run feel more forceful, so don't be afraid to over-animate. If a bad ground state can make your game unsatisfying or finicky, a bad jump will make it unplayable. A good system is one that saves the player more grief than he realizes, so for the sake of making your game feel more fair, let's sneak in a few handy cheats. Coyote time is a term that's been making the rounds more after a certain high-profile platformer utterly broke it, but in case you haven't heard of it, here's the rundown. Instead of only letting the player jump if they're directly grounded, you give the player a very short timer that refills when they're standing and depletes while airborne. If he presses the jump button before the timer hits 0, even if he's technically mid-air, the jump will still go through. That might sound like a huge concession, but trust me, it's worth making. If you've ever played a game where your jump felt unresponsive near edges, it probably wasn't. You likely played a perfectly functional game that just lacked this invisible safety net. Coyote time helps compensate for both human error and controller latency. It's a must. Applying the same principle in the opposite direction, have the player stick to the ceiling for a few frames after bumping his head. This trick can give both the player and designer a bit more leeway when levels get intricate and compact. A third and less universal idea is the bunny hop. I call it less universal because not every game benefits from it, but if yours features wide gaps or an emphasis on speed in general, giving your jump a bit of horizontal kick at the start is helpful. This can be additive, multiplicative, or a combination of both, and ensures that even from a near standstill, Frebb's jump will never go absolutely nowhere. That's a basis for a good simple platformer, but when building an action platformer, you have a few more options and responsibilities. Character movesets need to flow well and should also contribute something to traversal in and of themselves. I won't go through every character's every ability, but for the sake of this video it's worth discussing Frebb's basic moveset in detail. The Spin Punch is both Frebb's simplest and most versatile move. It functions as a long-lasting active hitbox, but also grants a quick burst of horizontal and vertical momentum. When used right off a ledge, the speed carries over into the air where friction is much lower. Using it right after a jump will increase the height you gain significantly, whereas spinning while falling serves as a short double jump. That's 3 separate movement tricks you can do in one single button input. Shifting into a more basic but still handy tool, Frebb's Slide Kick offers another active hitbox, this time with a more rigid but reliable motion to it. Prior to the introduction of a universal dodge mechanic, this was Frebb's main evasive move, but it now functions as a compromise between dodge and attack. You aren't invulnerable, but your hitbox is much lower, enemies are knocked above you instead of ahead, and making contact with a larger foe won't bounce you back. With proper spacing, it can even be followed up instantly with another attack. The Magic Hammer is a rather deceptive move. Given the fact you can't move or dodge while charging it, you'd expect it to serve as a mere damaging attack and nothing more. It does have one useful movement property though, the lunge Frebb takes while swinging. This motion occurs even mid-air, and is in fact the only attack that affects Frebb's horizontal speed while airborne. If properly set up, the max power version can even be used as an additional mid-air jump. So your moves are fast, responsive, and packed with utility. Now it's time to make sure they flow smoothly. Aside from a few highly committal power moves, there should never be more than half a second between the effective part of a move ending and the next move achieving its desired effect. Keep startup and end lag to a minimum. One trick that always makes the player feel more in control is animation canceling. Avoiding damage is the main reason people want to cancel an animation in the first place, so Frebb's new dodge system was the perfect opportunity to introduce this concept. If your game doesn't feature a dedicated dodge button, basic jumps are another good option to have moves cancel into. Another aspect of flow is knowing how much speed to leave your character with after an action finishes. It's often okay to have all momentum carry over, but in the case of high-speed airborne moves, it can be a good idea to pump the brakes a bit when the player lands. I found multiplying horizontal speed by 0.25 to 0.5 feels more natural than canceling all momentum, though committal power moves are, again, an exception. Good controls are one thing, but the player's trip through a level will only be as smooth as the path you lay out for him. Here are some general tips that'll make your early courses less bumpy. Number 1. Make your courses less bumpy. Varying terrain up is important, but avoid adding too many crags and potholes and one-tile inclines. If you know how to make slopes, use them. Number 2. Avoid excessive pits in the early game. Even if your game is meant to be challenging, don't throw too many sudden death traps at the player before they have a handle on the handling. No matter how trivial the actual jumps are, they're bound to catch new players more often than you expect. Be on the lookout for accidental traps. These can include leaps or drops of faith, where the player can't see their destination until they commit. If something in your design depends on them, use a trail of pickups to guide the player. Another less talked about pitfall are leaps of hate. That's what I call a jump that looks safe but has a new threat scroll on screen or otherwise activate midway through. This is never a welcome surprise. Don't do it. Make sure it doesn't happen. And finally, missable enemies that can come back to bite you while you're dealing with something tricky up ahead. While you shouldn't necessarily have to deal with every enemy you encounter, make sure any that you leave behind deactivates soon enough. Number 4. Introduce new level mechanics safely and one at a time. Don't let complicated, poorly explained gimmicks become unintended traps in and of themselves. Number 5. Give the player some breathing room. You won't get bored and leave having to walk one screen between every other major challenge. In fact, having a fair amount of space to just run and jump can be a good thing in a speed-oriented game. Number 6. Checkpoint the player frequently. There are arguments to be made on how punishing games should be in general, but the relative consistency and predictability of platform stages doesn't lend itself well to dozens of consecutive forced repeats. Number 7. Watch your enemy spacing and keep the duration of your player's attacks in mind. Don't place enemies in such a way that you're likely to hit one only for your attack to peter out just before you reach the second. You should be especially attentive to this during the opening of your game, where players are still getting used to the timing of all their abilities. Well, that's about all for now, I guess. Be sure to hang around for more videos like this. I'm not certain how often I'll make them, but design and analysis content's definitely something I want to get into. The next video I'm planning will be on how to make a small game feel like a huge adventure, so look forward to that if you want to give your story and theming a bit more punch. Talk at you later!